Hello and welcome back to our series of Learning to Code with P5JS. Today in this video, we will be covering a new topic called variables. So let's get started. All right, so what exactly are variables? Variables are just basically containers that hold value in our coding environment. And this is not only specific, this concept of variables is not only specific to JavaScript or P5 language, but you will notice this if you have already learned any other language, or if you plan to learn after this one another language, you will see that this concept will keep on appearing. So what that means basically is, and you know, this is not a new concept in the sense that we have been previously working with variables, even if we know it or not. So for instance, this one, window width, window height, this is also a variable that we have been using before. Another example, let's try to see is here. In our previous videos, if you notice that we have used let's not do it mouse position for now. Maybe we can do, remember, if we want to place a shape at the center of the canvas, and if we don't want to give it a fixed position, we can use half of width and half of height. So now if you see this width in itself and this height, these are also variables. The differences in this width and this height, there it is already decided, like in the P5 environment, it already knows what it means. So width is basically the width of the canvas and height is basically the height of the canvas. So half of width and half of height, and we have our circle drawn here right exactly at the center of the canvas. So another example that we can, I'm going to comment this out and perhaps we can see, is if we draw a line. If we start with mouse X, mouse Y, there's another one which is called P mouse X, and I'm just going to explain you what that is this. And it will be slightly glitchy, and let's see how that works. So if you see, you'll feel that there's something which is following the cursor, but you can't see the traces of it. So what we are doing here is, if instead of keeping the background in the draw function, we keep it in the setup function, that means that the background is not continuously being redrawn, right? Anything that is inside the setup function only happens once. So now if the background does not get refreshed, we will see something else. We will see all this line being drawn, right? Because the background is not refreshing, and wherever I'm moving my mouse, I can actually draw a line, right? So here, this is also working with some sort of variables that we have set as the parameters for the line. And what those parameters are, this mouse X, mouse Y, P mouse X, and P mouse Y. So mouse X and mouse Y, we have already discussed before, is basically the X and Y coordinates of the mouse or the cursor. P mouse X and P mouse Y are basically the previous position or the previous X coordinate of the mouse and the previous Y coordinate of the mouse. So what it is basically doing is, if you remember from the parameters of the line, that we need X and Y coordinates of 2 different points. So it is saying that, okay, your X1 and Y1 is going to be the existing mouse's X and Y position, and your X2 and Y2 is going to be the previous mouse's X and Y position, which is why we can continuously see a line being drawn. All right. So interestingly, these are the variables that sort of pre-exist in the P5 environment. We don't need to define them. It is already, there is some sort of code written in the background which is working for us. So this is not the only way for us to work with variables. We can also create our own variables. So let's see how we can do that. I'm going to start with here outside of our program. We can create variables and give them names of our own choosing. For instance, let's say, and this is the syntax, and I'm going to also discuss this in a bit. If I say let diameter is 100. So in this line of code, what I have done are 3 things that I well, technically 4 things, but let's talk about 3 things first. One is that I've started this statement with a let. So let is just another way of defining a variable. If in some previous codes that you might come across, you would see something called, instead of a let, you will see something called var. The thing is, let is just a more modern way. It has a history in its JavaScript versions that we are using let and avoiding some sort of complications, but technically var is also creating a variable. But for our sake, we are going to keep continuing working with let. There's another thing which is called const, which is for constant. And I'm going to talk about it. Well, I'm not going to discuss in detail, but I just want you to know that with let, what happens is the variable that we have created here, and we have given it a name diameter, we can change over a period of time the value that it contains. So for now, it is 100, but I'm going to discuss a bit later that this value of 100 doesn't have to or doesn't need to stay 100. It can change over a period of time. Again, going back, it's a variable, right? So it doesn't have to be fixed. But if we define the variable with const instead of let, that means that the value of the variable is going to be constant and it's not going to change. Okay, so we're not using this one at the moment. So let's go back to our let. All right, so now we know that every time we are going to define our variable, we are going to define it by saying let first, and then we're going to give the name of the variable. Now the name of the variable is slightly tricky in the sense that you can give any name that you please, but you have to be mindful of a few things. One thing, as you know, that we have been previously using some variables which are already predefined in the P5 environment, right? So those are reserved for P5. These keywords are something that we cannot use to create our own variables. What that would do is it's going to start conflicting with the understanding of the language itself that it already understands. So if I say let width is 100, now it will be confused because width is already defined in the environment as the width of the canvas. So I cannot give it another value. And then if I want to say, we can be just, try to be reasonable. You can create whatever names, but just make sure that over a period of time when you are writing your code, you give it a name, something that it will be easier for you to remember and identify with. That is that about names. Also, there are some rules and conventions about naming that you can say use alphabets. You can also use numbers. So if I say diameter 2, that's fine as well. But you cannot start the name with a number. So I can't say let 2 diameter. I can say let diameter 2, but not the other way around. And also you can add some underscore in the naming convention. So those are the things which are acceptable. All right, and then here, this is basically the value. What I'm saying here is that I have created a variable called diameter, and it will contain or hold a value 100. So this value can change over time, and we will discuss how so. But I'm going to show you here how we can use the variable below. One more thing that I want to talk about is this equal sign, and we will talk about arithmetic operators in a bit before I forget, is that here this sign of equals does not mean that diameter is equal to 100. It is only an assigning operator. That means that it is only assigning a value of 100 to this variable called diameter. So let's just say if instead of me saying 100 over here, I say, and again, I have to be mindful of not making spelling mistakes because then it would not understand. It is again giving me this circle, which is of 100 value. If I change it to 10 without me changing the name of the variable here, you can see how this has become smaller because now it is still going back here wherever the variable is and taking up that value. And then let's just make it a no fill for now. And we can see that here, or maybe let's just fill with some color and do a no stroke. or maybe let's not do this one. Let's give it, I don't know what color that might pop up. Purple? Okay, that's fine. Give it a no stroke. Also, if you add a fourth optional parameter here, you can control the opacity of the color. So let's say if I do 10 or I do 100, again, that is the maxed out as 255. Let's make this back as 100. We can change this value over time since it's also not moving at fields. If you can see, the minute it starts, it's a bit lighter, but since it kind of keeps on growing, it has become darker too. Anyway, but I'm not dealing with this right now. All right. So okay. So going back to our assigning using variables. So here we have our diameter, which is now 100. And we are able to use it. If let's say, and let's try to add another variable. So let me say, let us create a variable for the x position of the circle. All right. So just to make it easier for myself, I'll say, okay, x as 0 at this point in time. Okay, so now I am not, I haven't assigned it yet, but let's keep it at half of the height. And now I'm using x here. So if you can see, this is now at the 0 position of x. That means that, which is why we can see the half, remember, because it is a center point from where it starts. The center point of the circle is where the x position is by default. So if I need to change it over a period of time, I can change the value of it by saying x is x plus 1. And what it is doing is, first of all, this is creating like a very blob-like function. And if you can guess, this is happening because my background is not being refreshed. So it is in setup. If, let's say, I move it here, you can actually see the circle being moved. And this was also the reason that you could see only a bit of the opacity happening, where you could see the color light in a very short instance, and then it would grow and become maxed out. Now this is too light, right? Like if I make it 100, now this is this color, but this is now, because my background, it keeps on getting refreshed. So that was the reason or the difference between those things happening. Okay, so let's come back to this one. Why is this happening as, how is this value being changed? First of all, this might sound a bit different from how we are used to seeing these kind of equations in maths, right? Like, how is this x is x plus 1? What this basically means is that x starts with 0, right? Because that's the first time that we have assigned the value that has been assigned for the very first time that anything would happen to it. So starting from the 0 position, what we are saying is you are going to add 1 plus 1 to the value of x. So the first time the value of x is 0, right? So 0 plus 1. And then that is going to become the new value of x. So what it is doing is basically it is changing the variable x is changing value over a period of time. So the first time it's 0, then 0 plus 1, which means the value of x became 1, and then 1 plus 1, 2. So it is incrementally, it's basically increasing by 1. And this is how we see the position of this circle, because it's outside of the canvas, so we can't see it anymore. Doesn't mean that it had stopped. But since we have refreshed it, that's the starting point. So it is actually moving 1 pixel each time. And that's how we see the shift in x position happening. So this is the beauty with, working with variables, is that we can not only use the ones which are already existing in the P5 environment, you can always go back to the reference page and see which are all the variables, like these are reserved keywords. But also at the same time, you can create your own variables and play around with them, change values, and see how that works. Another thing is about the data type. So if you look into this right now, I have given both of them as numbers, but variables not only hold numbers, they can hold different kind of data types. So those data types could be A, numbers that we have already worked with, yes. B, it could be strings. By strings, I mean letters and alphabets. So for instance, not the best example, but let's try. If we create another variable, which is a background color, and I call it or give it a color, which is, let's say, orange. And now, instead of me writing any sort of string or number here, what if I use this variable inside this? So I'm going to comment that one out for now and see how that kind of works, okay? So now you can see that I have again called the variable or used the variable inside the background here, and this has changed color. If let's say if I change it to blue, which is going to be super bright, I think, again, but you can see it's like very light, the circle, but this has also changed. So without me changing anything here, wherever the variables are mentioned, if I only change the value, it gets impacted, okay? All right, and we can keep seeing the color being changed differently because again, it's on a different kind of a background color, and I have also made the opacity. I've changed the opacity. It's not completely opaque at this point in time. Okay, so not the most optimal way, but this is just showing you that there are more ways and more kind of data types that can be stored in variables. There is something, there are also different kinds of data types which include Boolean. Boolean basically, okay, I should comment it out first. So here we are talking about numbers. There are also strings, which we just discussed. Then there are Booleans. Booleans are basically, it means true or false. So it is going to hold the state of something as either 1 or 0. So like true or false, that's kind of thing that we will come across later on, and we'll talk about it, how we can use it. And of course, then there are different kind of objects that can be stored. Those are a bit more complex, and we are going to talk about them much later when, let's say, we talk about media, right? So working with images or sound or more of those things, arrays and stuff. So those are some sort of data that variables can hold. All right. Another thing is are the arithmetic operators. So if you know, and you might have noticed that we have sort of worked before as well. These are some very simple ones, just like our simple math, plus, minus, division, and everything, which you have been sort of working already before. So if you remember when we were working with half of width and half of height, so you can see we've already used, you know, instead of 1 divided by 2, that's what we actually did. What if, let's say, you can actually use these operators to work with variables as well. So right now, if you can see, let's refresh it, the diameter is 100. Let's see if I want to change the size and I, you know, make it twice as big. So I've just multiplied it by 2, by 3, you'll see it even bigger. Or I can make it smaller and I can use decimal point, or you can do it divided by 2, and that's going to be this similar kind of thing. All right. And here you've already seen we have done +1, plus and -1 and stuff. You can do that. Another thing here, interestingly, is also some of the reserved variables that we have talked about, you don't necessarily have to use them here. So for instance, I'm gonna, okay, let's try to do this here. And for now, I'm going to make it 0. Let's comment this one out. So what this would happen is Now this is at the 0 position, so you can see, or maybe we can see only half of it. So maybe we can just centralize it so we can see the full picture. So if you can see it now, because mouse X's position is determining the size of the circle. So the closer I am to 0, smaller it gets, the farther away I'm towards the maximum width of the canvas, the larger it gets, right? So you can use these variables at different places and positions depending on what are your needs and what are you trying to achieve. And I think that is a good starting point. I think one more thing that I want to mention here is the scope of the variable. Yeah, I totally forgot about that. All right, so why we are creating all of these variables outside of our code? This is important for us to know because that defines the scope of the variable. That means that where these variables can be used. Okay, so since these are outside of any of these functions or code, that means that I can call these variables wherever I need them and they will sort of work, right? They will work. If let's say I put, let's pick this one. I've already moved this one here. So let's go back to our X so that I can show you the example with this. If let's say I put this here, now we can see some error happening. It's saying that you have assigned it a value and you're never used it, but technically I'm trying to call it and use it, but that's not working. Why? Because anything that's happening within this block of code, within these curly brackets, is just applicable to this function only, right? This chunk of code. So if I'm calling it in another function, it will not know because this one is a local variable. That means that it only resides within this set or block of code. So if I need to use it here, that's not working. We need to make it global. That means that I can call it here or I can call it here and it will work. The caveat with, or sometimes that we have to be mindful of is that if I use it here in the draw function, the thing with this is that anything that happens within the draw function gets reset every time the frame gets reset. So it might not work exactly the way we want it to. That does not mean that we do not create variables within the draw function. It's just that for general purpose, when you're creating it, you can just create them as global variables, but later on we will learn how to create variables within the draw function as well for our needs too. Or maybe I can just show you and it might sort of, you'll see that it is keep getting refreshed and redrawn. So it feels like it's stuck and it's not moving and it's not being called, but technically there is no error. It's just that it's not functioning the way we want it to perform. So it's a good thing that we are creating a global variable for it and we can easily access it. All right, so I think that we have covered variables, we have covered scope of variables, we have talked about data types. One more thing about data types is that in our JavaScript or in this P5, we don't need to worry about the kind of data when we are defining our variable. So that is pretty easy. We can just put let. In some other coding languages, you have to be very specific that I am defining a variable which will contain the data type, you know, either a number or something. So there are different, let's say, syntax to basically write that, but we don't need to worry about it. It's just some additional info if you choose to learn other languages. Yeah, I think I've covered most of those things before I forget. So why don't you start practicing with and play around with some variables, and then we can move forward with some more concept around conditionals, how to use them, and also talk more about some motion.